The sign was painted on a bedsheet because that's all they could afford. "We're not bastards," it read, held by two 15-year-olds who just walked into their billionaire father's engagement party uninvited. Richard Bryson didn't recognize them at first, standing there in thrift store clothes while 300 millionaires stared. Then he saw their eyes, storm gray, just like his own. These were the twins he walked away from 15 years ago when their mother was 22 and alone and terrified. And now they were standing in his ballroom, demanding the one thing he'd never given them: acknowledgement. The champagne was still fizzing in his glass when his entire life started to collapse. The Bryson Grand Hotel ballroom looked like something out of a fairy tale someone very rich had written. Chandeliers dripped crystal light across white marble floors. Champagne flutes caught the glow like tiny captured stars. Every table held orchids flown in from Singapore, and every guest wore the kind of jewelry that required insurance paperwork. Richard Bryson stood near the raised platform at the front of the room, perfectly composed in his charcoal suit, cufflinks gleaming, jaw set in that expression magazines called commanding. He was 42 years old, CEO of Bryson Innovations, owner of a tech empire that touched 5 continents, and according to Forbes, one of the 10 most influential men in global software development. Tonight was supposed to be flawless. His fiancée, Ellen Harris, stood beside him in a gown the color of winter roses, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She smiled at the photographers lining the walls, her posture perfect, her diamond engagement ring catching every flash. Ellen was the daughter of Brandon Harris, an industrial magnate whose manufacturing empire complemented Richard's technology ventures like two puzzle pieces designed by a corporate strategist. Their engagement wasn't just romantic, it was a merger, a union that would open doors across Europe and Asia, create shareholder value, and position both families as unstoppable. Richard should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt restless, hollow, like a man standing in a beautifully decorated room with all the windows sealed shut. He forced himself to smile as Brandon Harris approached, booming with laughter, clapping Richard's shoulder like they were old friends instead of strategic partners. "Tonight's the night, son. The Bryson Harris future begins." Richard nodded, said the right things, raised his glass when toasts were offered. But beneath the surface, something gnawed at him, something he'd been ignoring for years. A quietness that crept in late at night when he removed his cufflinks and stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. A whisper that asked if all of this wealth, all of this success was what he'd actually wanted, or just what he'd convinced himself to want after he walked away from the only thing that ever felt real. He shook the thought away, told himself he was being ridiculous, told himself the past was dead. He was wrong. At exactly 8:47 p.m., the ornate double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open with a sound that silenced 300 guests mid-conversation. 2 teenagers stood in the doorway. The boy was tall, lanky, dressed in jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt that looked like it had been pulled from the back of a thrift store rack. His dark hair was messy, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping one side of a bedsheet that had been painted with shaking letters. The girl stood beside him, smaller but no less defiant, her storm gray eyes blazing with the kind of rage that comes from 15 years of being dismissed. She held the other side of the sheet, her knuckles white, her breath coming fast. The banner stretched between them, wrinkled and wobbling and heartbreakingly young. "We're not bastards." And beneath it, in smaller, angrier letters, "We know who our father is." The room froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd, like a wave breaking against rocks. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Photographers turned, cameras clicking frantically. Brandon Harris stiffened beside Richard, his face darkening with fury. Ellen's hand tightened on Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. And Richard felt the entire world tilt beneath his feet. Because the boy's eyes were storm gray. The same shade Richard saw every morning in the mirror. The same shape, the same intensity. And the girl's chin tilted in defiance, exactly the way his own did when he refused to back down in boardroom negotiations. He knew those faces. He knew them because he'd spent 15 years trying to forget them. "Joe, Rebecca, no!" A woman's voice cracked from behind the twins, breathless and mortified. Ala Richmond stumbled forward, her face pale, her hands reaching for the banner like she could somehow erase what had already been seen. Richard's chest tightened. Allah. She looked older, tired. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain coat over clothes that had clearly seen years of wear. But her eyes, those eyes that used to look at him like he was the only person in the world who mattered, were filled with panic and shame. And pain. So much pain, it made Richard's throat close. "Who the hell are these people?" Brandon Harris hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Richard, what is this?" Ellen turned to him, her expression confused, frightened. "Richard?" But Richard couldn't answer. Couldn't move. Couldn't do anything except stare at the two teenagers standing beneath the chandelier, holding that wrinkled banner like it was the only truth that mattered. Joe stepped forward, his voice shaking, but loud enough to carry across the silent ballroom. "You left us." Rebecca's voice cracked as she added, "You pretended we don't exist." The boy's hands trembled. "And now you're standing here pretending you're some perfect man with a perfect fiancé." "Like we're nothing," Rebecca whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. The cameras exploded with flashes. Guests began whispering frantically, pulling out phones, recording, texting, uploading. Brandon Harris grabbed Richard's arm. "Get security. Get them out. Now." Ellen's voice was barely audible. "Richard, who are they?" And Richard, who never lost his composure, who built an empire on control and precision, who convinced himself the past could be buried under enough success, felt something inside him crack wide open. Because standing in front of him, holding a hand-painted bedsheet and 15 years of abandonment, were his children. Joe and Rebecca. The twins he walked away from when they were too young to remember his face. The twins he told himself he'd deal with later. The twins whose mother he accused of trying to trap him. The twins he convinced himself didn't need him. He'd been lying to himself for 15 years. And now, the truth was standing in his ballroom, demanding to be seen. Allah's voice broke through the chaos, desperate and pleading. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I'm so sorry they weren't supposed to." But Joe cut her off, his voice rising with anger and heartbreak. "You don't get to apologize for us, Mom." Rebecca lifted the banner higher, her entire body shaking. "We're not going to be invisible anymore." Richard's throat tightened, his hands went cold. Brandon Harris barked orders at security guards hovering near the walls. "Remove them, immediately." Ellen stepped back, her hand slipping from Richard's arm, her face pale with shock. And Richard. Richard looked at his children, really looked at them. At the pain in their eyes, the defiance, the desperation to be acknowledged. At the bedsheet banner painted in a teenager's shaky handwriting because they didn't have money for anything better. At Allah standing behind them, trembling, trying to protect them even as they refused to be protected. And for the first time in 15 years, Richard Bryson made a choice that wasn't about his career, his image, or his empire. He stepped forward. "No one touches them," he said quietly. Brandon Harris froze. "What?" Richard's voice was firmer now, cutting through the whispers and camera flashes. "I said no one touches them." The security guards stopped. The ballroom fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes before everything changes. Richard walked toward the twins. Ignoring Ellen's whispered, "Richard, what are you doing?" Ignoring Brandon's hissed threats. Ignoring the 300 guests watching his world unravel in real time. He stopped a few feet in front of Joe and Rebecca, close enough to see the tears on Rebecca's face, close enough to see Joe's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. And Richard Bryson, billionaire CEO, global tech titan, America's most eligible bachelor, whispered the only words that mattered. "Dear God, what have I done?" You know, some moments change everything. One second you're watching someone's perfect life, and the next, you're seeing the cracks they've been hiding for years. If you've ever wondered what happens when the truth finally catches up to people who've been running from it, you're in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is just beginning, and trust me, you'll want to see how it unfolds. 15 years earlier, Richard Bryson was 27 years old and had just secured his first real venture capital meeting. He wore a suit from Macy's clearance rack and carried a laptop held together with electrical tape, but his pitch deck was flawless, and his ambition burned hot enough to light up entire city blocks. Alla Richmond was 22, an architecture student with calloused hands from drafting pencils and a smile that could disarm anyone. She worked part-time as an event assistant for corporate functions to pay her tuition, setting up chairs and clearing champagne glasses, while men in expensive suits ignored her existence. Richard noticed her immediately. She was arranging table settings at a tech conference when he walked past, rehearsing his pitch under his breath. She looked up, caught his eye, and said, "You're going to do great, I can tell." He'd stopped mid-stride. "How do you know?" "Because you look terrified," she'd replied, grinning. People who care that much always do better than people who don't. 3 hours later, after his pitch secured $200,000 in seed funding, Richard found her in the hotel kitchen wrapping leftover pastries for the staff. He'd asked if he could buy her coffee. She'd laughed and said, "You just got funded. I'll buy you coffee." They talked until 4 in the morning. Within 2 months, they were inseparable. Richard would show up at her apartment with takeout and blueprints, sprawling across her floor while she sketched building designs, and he coded late into the night. She believed in him when no one else did. He saw her brilliance when the world dismissed her as just another waitress clearing tables. "We're going to build something incredible," he'd whispered one night, holding her close in her tiny studio apartment. "You're going to design buildings that change skylines. I'm going to build software that changes the world. And we'll do it together," she'd said, kissing him softly. He'd meant it when he said it, believed it with everything he had. But that was before. Before the company started gaining traction, before the investors started circling, before the pressure turned from exciting to suffocating. And before Alice stood in his cramped office one rainy October afternoon, her hands shaking, and whispered, "I'm pregnant." Richard's world stopped. He stared at her, his laptop screen glowing behind him, with investor emails, and product timelines, and growth projections that suddenly felt impossibly fragile. "You're what?" "Pregnant." Her voice was steadier now, but her eyes were terrified. "I know the timing isn't perfect, but..." "The timing isn't perfect." Richard stood up, running his hands through his hair. "Allah, I'm about to close the biggest deal of my life. We're launching in 3 months. Investors are watching everything. I can't." "Can't what?" Her voice cracked. "Can't have a family?" "That's not what I said." But panic was rising in his chest, choking him. "I just need time to think." She'd left his office that day, with tears streaming down her face. He'd told himself he'd call her later, told himself they'd figure it out. But later kept getting pushed back. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Richard threw himself into work, convincing himself that if he could just get the company stable, if he could just secure the next round of funding, then he'd be ready. When Allah finally came to his apartment a month later, she looked exhausted, thinner, like she'd been carrying the weight of the world alone. "It's twins," she said quietly. "I'm having twins, Richard." And that's when fear twisted into something uglier. "Twins?" His voice came out harsh, defensive. "How do you even know they're mine?" The moment the words left his mouth, he wanted to take them back, wanted to swallow them whole and pretend he'd never been cruel enough to say something so unforgivable. But it was too late. Allah's face went white, then red, then crumpled entirely. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you?" "Allah, I didn't mean..." "Yes, you did." Tears poured down her face, but her voice was steel. "You meant exactly what you said. You're looking for a way out, and you just found one. That's not fair." "Fair?" She laughed bitterly. "You think any of this is fair?" "I'm 22 years old, Richard. I'm trying to finish school. I work 3 jobs, and I'm about to have 2 babies, because the man who said he loved me is more terrified of being a father than he is of losing everything that actually matters." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, to say something, anything that would make this hurt less. But he didn't, because deep down, she was right. Allah left that night. And when Richard tried calling her the next day, her number was disconnected. When he went to her apartment, she was gone, moved, vanished. He told himself she'd come back. Told himself she was being dramatic. Told himself he dodged a bullet. Then he buried himself in work. Bryson Innovations grew, funding rounds closed, products launched, success piled on top of success, until Richard could barely remember what his life had looked like before. He dated other women, built other relationships, convinced himself that Allah had been a distraction he couldn't afford. But late at night, alone in apartments that got bigger and emptier, he'd think about her. Wonder where she was. Wonder if she'd really had the twins. Wonder if they had his eyes. He never looked for answers, because answers meant responsibility, and responsibility meant facing what he'd done. So he didn't look. Allah gave birth to Joe and Rebecca on a freezing January morning in a county hospital where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the nurses were overworked and kind. She held her babies and sobbed not from pain, but from the crushing realization that she was completely alone. No family, no Richard, no safety net. Just two tiny humans who needed everything she didn't know how to give. She worked as a receptionist during the day and cleaned office buildings at night while a neighbor watched the twins. She sewed clothes from thrift store fabric. She stretched every dollar until it screamed. She missed meals so her children could eat. She cried in bathroom stalls during her lunch breaks and smiled when she came home so Joe and Rebecca would never know how close they were to falling apart. And she never spoke ill of Richard. When Joe asked why other kids had dads, and he didn't, Alice said, "Your father is a very busy man, doing important work." When Rebecca wondered aloud if their father even knew they existed, Alice said, "Of course he knows. Sometimes grown-ups just make complicated choices." She wouldn't poison them with her pain, wouldn't turn their father into a villain even though he'd earned the title 1,000 times over. But protection only goes so far. Kids hear things, whispers at school, comments from neighbors. The world has a way of making children feel unwanted, even when their mother would burn down the sky to prove otherwise. Alla was folding laundry in her cramped living room when her phone buzzed with a notification. She almost ignored it. She was exhausted, bone-deep tired in the way only single mothers understand, but something made her glance at the screen. Breaking. Billionaire CEO Richard Bryson announces engagement to Ellen Harris. Her breath caught. The article featured a photo of Richard in a tailored suit, standing beside a woman who looked like she'd been designed in a lab for magazine covers. The headline gushed about the power couple and their upcoming celebration at the Bryson Grand Hotel. Alla's hands trembled. 15 years. 15 years of silence. 15 years of struggling alone, while Richard built an empire and pretended his children didn't exist. And now he was getting engaged. To someone who'd never had to choose between groceries and electricity. Someone who'd never stitched her children's clothes because new ones were too expensive. Someone who fit perfectly into his pristine, curated world. "Mom?" Alla looked up. Joe and Rebecca stood in the doorway, staring at her phone screen. Their faces were unreadable. But their eyes, those storm gray eyes that looked so heartbreakingly like Richard's, were filled with something that made Alla's chest tighten. Recognition and rage. "That's him, isn't it?" Joe's voice was quiet. Dangerous. Alla closed her phone quickly. "It's nothing. Just, that's our father." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. "The one who's too busy to even send a birthday card." "Rebecca, he's getting married, Mom." Joe's voice cracked. "He's standing there, smiling like we don't even exist." Alla reached for them, but they stepped back. And in that moment, staring at her 15-year-old twins, who'd spent their entire lives wondering why they weren't enough, Alla saw something shift in their expressions. Something determined. Something that terrified her. "Don't," she whispered. "Please. Whatever you're thinking, don't." But Joe and Rebecca weren't children anymore. They were teenagers who'd been dismissed, whispered about, and erased. And they were done being invisible. Some of you watching this know exactly what Allah's going through. You've been the one who stayed when someone else walked away. You've been the one working double shifts and wearing a brave face so your children never see you break. And maybe you've wondered if anyone even notices how hard you're fighting. You're not alone in this. If these stories speak to you, if you see yourself in these moments, hit that subscribe button. We're building something here. A place where these stories matter. Where you matter. The ballroom had descended into chaos. 300 guests buzzed with whispers that grew louder by the second. Cell phones emerged from designer clutches and jacket pockets, screens glowing as people texted, recorded, posted. The photographers who'd been hired to capture Richard and Ellen's perfect announcement were now documenting the collapse of that perfection in real time. Brandon Harris stepped forward, his face flushed with rage barely contained beneath expensive cologne and corporate authority. "Get security in here, now." Two guards in dark suits moved toward the twins. Joe stepped back instinctively, his hand tightening on the banner. Rebecca's entire body went rigid, but she didn't lower the sign. She lifted it higher, her jaw set with the kind of defiance that comes from having nothing left to lose. And Richard, standing between his collapsing engagement party and the children he'd abandoned, made a choice that shocked everyone in the room. No one touches them. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. Brandon Harris froze mid-gesture. "Excuse me?" Richard turned to face him, and something in his expression made the security guards stop in their tracks. "I said no one touches them." Ellen's voice trembled from somewhere behind him. "Richard, what are you?" "They're my children," Richard said quietly. The words landed like stones, dropped into still water, rippling outward until every conversation stopped, and no one is removing them. The room went silent again. Not the shocked silence from before, but something heavier, something that felt like the moment before a building collapses. Brandon Harris's face darkened. "I've already made plenty," Richard replied. "I'm not making another one." Alla pushed forward, her face pale, her hands reaching for her children. "Joe, Rebecca, we need to go. Right now." "No." Joe's voice cracked but held firm. "Please," Alla begged, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Then how was it supposed to happen, Mom?" Rebecca's voice rose, raw and furious. "When were we supposed to matter? When he's 70? When we're dead? When?" The pain in her voice made several guests look away. Alla grabbed for the banner, trying to pull it down, but the twins held tight. "You don't understand." "We understand perfectly," Joe interrupted. "We understand that he's been pretending we don't exist for 15 years. We understand that he's getting married and starting over like we were nothing. We understand that." "I never told you to do this." Alla's voice broke completely. "I never wanted you to come here." The confession hung in the air. Richard's head snapped toward Alla. "What?" Ellen stepped closer, her expression confused and horrified. "What do you mean you didn't tell them?" Alla's shoulders shook. "I didn't. I swear I didn't. I tried to keep them away. I tried to protect everyone from this exact moment." "Protect him, you mean?" Joe said bitterly. "You've been protecting him our entire lives. That's not fair, Joe." "Fair?" Rebecca's laugh was harsh and broken. "You want to talk about fair? Do you know what the neighbors said last week?" Alla went very still. "Rebecca, don't. They were talking outside our building." Rebecca's voice shook, but she kept going. "Mrs. Chen and that woman from the 3rd floor. They didn't know we could hear them through the window." Richard felt his chest tighten. "They said we were fatherless nobodies," Joe continued, his hands clenched so tightly around the banner that his knuckles had gone white. "They said our dad probably doesn't even remember we exist. They said Mom should have gotten rid of us when she had the chance." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alla made a sound like something inside her had shattered. "Oh, babies." "And then we saw the article." Rebecca's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "About his engagement party. About this perfect life he's building with his perfect fiancée in his perfect world where we don't exist. So we decided," Joe said, lifting his chin, "that we were done being invisible." Richard felt like he'd been struck. "You painted this?" He gestured to the banner. Rebecca nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I painted it, alone, at 2 a.m. when Mom was working her night shift. I used bed sheets and paint from the dollar store, because that's all we could afford." The details landed like blows. Dollar store paint, a bed sheet, 2 a.m. While Richard had been sleeping in Egyptian cotton in a penthouse that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. "We practiced what we'd say," Joe added. "We planned how we'd get past security. We knew Mom would try to stop us if she found out, so we didn't tell her." Alla's face crumpled. "You could have been hurt. You could have been arrested. You could have—" "We could have finally told the truth," Rebecca interrupted. "That's all we wanted, Mom. Just once. Just to have someone acknowledge that we exist." Joe's voice broke completely. "I'm tired. I'm so tired of people assuming we don't matter, that we're mistakes, that we're bastards who don't deserve to know who our father is." He looked directly at Richard, and the pain in his storm gray eyes that matched Richard's own, was unbearable. "We're not nothing," Joe whispered. "We're not." Richard felt something crack open inside his chest, felt 15 years of buried guilt and regret and cowardice rise up and choke him. He'd done this, built his empire on the broken backs of the people who should have mattered most, convinced himself that success could replace love, that money could erase responsibility, that he could walk away from 2 babies and never look back. He'd been wrong about everything. Brandon Harris grabbed Richard's arm, his voice low and threatening. End this. Right now. Tell them they're mistaken. Deny everything. Or, we're pulling out of the merger tonight. Richard looked at Brandon, at his red face and furious eyes and the kind of cold calculation that put profit over humanity. He looked at Ellen, standing frozen in her winter rose gown, her engagement ring catching the chandelier light. He looked at the 300 guests watching him with a mixture of horror and fascination, and the kind of morbid curiosity that accompanies watching someone's life fall apart in public. And then he looked at Joe and Rebecca, at their wrinkled thrift store clothes and their hand-painted banner and their storm-gray eyes filled with years of wondering why they weren't enough. Richard pulled his arm from Brandon's grip. The party's over, he said quietly. Richard, Ellen started. Everyone needs to leave. Richard's voice was louder now, carrying across the ballroom with the kind of authority that had built boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals. The engagement celebration is over. Please leave. Now. Chaos erupted. Guests protested. Photographers surged forward. Cameras flashing. Brandon Harris shouted threats about lawsuits and reputation and destroying everything Richard had built. But Richard didn't care. He walked toward the twins. Cameras followed him. Phones recorded every step. The entire world would see this moment, the billionaire CEO walking away from his engagement party toward the children holding a bedsheet banner. Richard stopped a few feet in front of Joe and Rebecca. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Joe's jaw clenched. Rebecca's tears fell faster. And Allah, standing behind her children with her entire body shaking, watched the man who'd broken her heart finally face what he'd done. Richard looked at the banner in their hands, at the wobbly letters painted by a 15-year-old girl who deserved so much better than a father who'd made her doubt her worth. You're not bastards, Richard said, his voice breaking. You're my children, and I'm the one who's been nothing. Joe's grip on the banner loosened. Rebecca's shoulders shook with sobs. And for the first time in 15 years, Richard Bryson stopped running from the truth. This is the part where everything shifts, isn't it? When someone finally stops pretending and starts facing what they've done. If you've ever waited years for an apology that seemed like it would never come, you know this feeling. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think some mistakes are too big to fix? Or is it never too late to try? We read every single comment, and your stories matter to us. The ballroom emptied slowly, guests dragging their feet as they whispered and stared, unwilling to miss a single moment of the spectacle. Camera flashes still popped like distant fireworks. Phone screens glowed as people typed furiously, uploading videos, posting commentary, turning Richard's private devastation into public entertainment. Ellen stood frozen near the platform, her winter rose gown suddenly looking too bright, too perfect, too much like a costume she'd been wearing without knowing the play had changed. Her hands trembled as she touched the diamond engagement ring on her finger, turning it absently, as if testing whether it still belonged there. Brandon Harris stormed toward Richard, his face red enough that several remaining guests stepped back instinctively. My office, now. Richard didn't move. He was still staring at Joe and Rebecca, at the banner hanging limply between them, at Allah standing behind her children, with tears streaming down her face. Richard, Brandon's voice cracked like a whip. Do you understand what you've just done? Do you have any idea the damage you've caused? Richard finally turned to face him. Yes. Then fix it. Brandon's jaw clenched. Tell these people they're lying. Tell them they've mistaken you for someone else. Tell them, no. The word landed with finality. Brandon's eyes went wide with fury. Excuse me? I'm not denying them. Richard's voice was quiet, but immovable. They're my children. And I'm not pretending they don't exist. Not anymore. Then you're a fool. Brandon stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I'm pulling the merger, tonight. The Harris family will not be associated with this kind of scandal. We will not be dragged into your sordid personal failures. Richard felt something shift inside him, a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Then pull it. Brandon stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You're throwing away billions of dollars. International expansion. Your entire future. No, Richard said quietly. I'm throwing away the future I thought I wanted. There's a difference. Brandon's face twisted with contempt. You'll regret this. I already regret plenty, Richard replied. But this won't be one of them. Brandon Harris turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit, barking orders at his assistants. Within minutes, the remaining members of the Harris family followed, their designer shoes clicking sharply against marble as they abandoned what was supposed to be a celebration. Ellen watched them leave, her expression caught somewhere between horror and devastation. Then she turned to Richard. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alone. Richard nodded. He glanced at Alla, who was still trying to coax Joe and Rebecca toward the door, her face flushed with shame. Wait for me. Please. Don't leave. Alla looked at him with something that might have been fury, or exhaustion, or both. Richard, please, he repeated. Just give me 10 minutes. Then, we need to talk. All of us. Alla's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She guided the twins toward a side lounge, away from the remaining guests and cameras. Richard followed Ellen into a private corridor off the ballroom, closing the door behind them. The muffled chaos from the party barely penetrated the thick walls, leaving them in sudden, suffocating silence. Ellen turned to face him, and Richard saw tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, leaving mascara tracks that looked like wounds. Who are they? Her voice shook. Really, tell me the truth. They're my children, Richard said. From 15 years ago, before I became this. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the expensive suit and the billionaire image and everything that had seemed so important an hour ago. Ellen pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself. You have children, 15-year-old children, and you never told me. I know. You were going to marry me, merge our families, our companies, our lives, and you never mentioned that you abandoned 2 children? The word abandoned hit like a physical blow. Yes, Richard said quietly. That's exactly what I did. Ellen laughed, but it came out broken and bitter. Do you know how humiliating this is? Do you know what people are saying right now? What they're posting online? Richard pulled out his phone. The notifications were exploding. Hundreds, thousands. His name was trending. Videos from the ballroom were already circulating. Amateur footage of the twins holding their banner. Of him walking toward them. Of the entire engagement party collapsing in real time. Number Bryson scandal. Number Secret twins. Number Billionaire exposed. The headlines were already writing themselves. I'm sorry, Richard said, putting the phone away. I know this isn't fair to you. Ellen wiped her eyes, smearing mascara further. You've been distant for months, cold. I told myself you were just stressed, that the merger was weighing on you. But it wasn't the merger, was it? Richard said nothing. It was this, Ellen's voice cracked. It was them. It was whatever you've been running from for 15 years, finally catching up to you. I didn't know they'd come tonight, Richard said. I didn't know. But you knew they existed. Ellen stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. You knew you had children out there somewhere, children you walked away from. And you looked me in the eye, and proposed and planned this entire future, without once thinking I deserved to know the truth. Richard felt the weight of every choice he'd made, pressing down on him. You're right. Of course I'm right. Ellen's voice rose, then broke. Richard, I thought we had something real. I thought you loved me. The silence that followed was answer enough. Ellen's face crumpled. You don't, do you? You don't love me. Richard opened his mouth, tried to find words that would soften the blow. But there was nothing to say except the truth. There's something I never faced, he said quietly. Something I buried under work and success and everything I built after I walked away from Alla. And tonight, it finally caught up to me. Alla, Ellen repeated, tasting the name like poison. The woman with them, that's her? Yes, and you loved her. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded. I did. I do. I never stopped. I just convinced myself I had. Ellen took off her engagement ring slowly, deliberately, and held it between them. The diamond caught the hallway light, sparkling with all the promise that had just shattered. You don't love me, she said again, her voice steadier now. You never did. Richard didn't deny it. Ellen pressed the ring into his palm, her hand cold and trembling. I deserve someone who chooses me, not someone who's been living half a life while pretending the other half doesn't exist. You do, Richard agreed. You deserve so much better than what I could give you. Ellen stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself like she was holding the pieces together. I hope you know what you're doing. Because you just destroyed everything. I know. And for what? For children who hate you? For a woman who looks at you like you're the worst mistake she ever made? Richard thought about Joe's trembling voice, saying, "We're not nothing." About Rebecca painting a banner alone at 2 in the morning. About Allah working night shifts to feed the family he should have been supporting. For the chance, he said quietly, to finally be someone worth knowing. Ellen stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away, her heels echoing down the corridor, until the sound faded completely. Richard stood alone in the hallway, holding the engagement ring in his palm, listening to the muffled chaos from the ballroom, where his carefully constructed life had just collapsed. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the side lounge where Allah and his children were waiting. For the first time in 15 years, Richard Bryson was about to face the truth without running. The side lounge was smaller than the ballroom, but no less luxurious. Cream-colored leather sofas sat beneath abstract paintings that probably cost more than Allah's annual rent. A glass wall overlooked the city lights, Manhattan glittering like broken promises. Joe and Rebecca sat side by side on one sofa, still gripping their banner like a shield. Allah stood behind them, one hand resting protectively on Rebecca's shoulder, her face pale and exhausted. She looked like a woman who'd been running for 15 years and had finally been forced to stop. Richard closed the door behind him, muffling the distant chaos of departing guests. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bones. He stood awkwardly near the door, still holding Ellen's engagement ring in his pocket, unsure where to begin. Unsure if there even were words that could bridge 15 years of absence. "Sit down," Allah said quietly. "If we're doing this, sit down." Richard sat across from them, the coffee table between them feeling like an ocean. For a long moment, no one spoke. Joe stared at the floor, Rebecca's hands twisted in her lap. Allah's jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. "Tell me," Richard said finally. "Tell me what it was like. Growing up, I need to know." Joe's head snapped up, his storm gray eyes blazing. "You need to know? You had 15 years to find out. Why does it matter now?" "Because I'm asking," Richard said simply. "Because I should have asked years ago. Because I owe you the chance to tell me everything. I was too much of a coward to face." Rebecca's voice came out small and broken. "Kids at school used to ask why we didn't have a dad. I didn't know what to say. Mom told us you were busy, that you were important. But kids aren't stupid. They knew what that meant." "It meant we were nobodies," Joe added bitterly. "It meant our own father didn't want us enough to even send a birthday card." Allah's hand tightened on Rebecca's shoulder. "We moved 3 times because landlords kept raising rent, and Mom couldn't keep up." Rebecca continued, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We wore thrift store clothes. Other kids made fun of Joe's shoes because they had holes in them. Mom would stay up all night, sewing patches on everything we owned." Joe's voice cracked. "She worked herself half to death for us. And you were, where? Building your empire? Buying penthouses? Pretending we didn't exist?" Each word landed like a blow. "Yes," Richard said quietly. "That's exactly what I was doing." "Why?" Rebecca's voice broke completely. "Why weren't we worth knowing?" Richard felt his throat close. "Because I was terrified. Because I was 27 and stupid, and convinced that being a father would destroy everything I'd worked for. Because when your mother told me she was pregnant, I panicked." "So you ran," Joe said flatly. "I ran." Richard agreed. "I told myself it was temporary. That I'd figure it out later. But later turned into months. Then years. Then 15 years," Allah interrupted, her voice sharp. 15 years of silence. Richard looked at her, really looked at her. At the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. At the exhaustion etched into her face. At the woman who'd carried the weight of his cowardice alone. "I'm not going to make excuses," he said. "I could tell you I was young and scared. I could tell you the company was fragile and investors were watching. I could tell you I didn't know how to be a father. But none of that matters. Because the truth is simpler and uglier than any excuse I could offer. Then say it, Allah demanded. Richard met her eyes. I chose my ambition over you. Over them. I chose success over love. And I've spent 15 years building an empire on the foundation of the family I abandoned. The silence that followed felt like a wound opening. Then Allah's face crumpled. You didn't even give me a chance. What do you mean? Her hands were shaking now, her voice rising. I tried, Richard. I tried to contact you. Richard went very still. What? I emailed you. Tears streamed down Allah's face. Months after I left, I sent emails to your company address. I called your office. I even wrote letters and mailed them to your building. I tried to tell you about the twins. I tried to give you a chance to be part of their lives. Richard felt the room tilt. I never received anything. I know, Allah said bitterly. Because Mabel intercepted them. Mabel? Richard's voice came out strangled. My assistant? Your assistant, Allah confirmed. I finally confronted her 2 years ago. Ran into her at a coffee shop. She was drunk and guilty, and she told me everything. Richard felt physically ill. What did she say? That she'd been protecting you. Allah's laugh was harsh and broken. Protecting your career. She said young fathers were liability risks for investors. She said my emails and calls would distract you during a critical growth phase, so she deleted every message, threw away every letter. Told me you'd instructed her to block all contact. Rebecca's eyes went wide. She lied? She lied, Allah whispered. And I believed her. I believed that Richard had specifically ordered her to erase us. Joe turned to Richard, his face twisted with rage and devastation. So you could have known. You could have been there. You just didn't check. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Richard's hands were shaking. I trusted her. I trusted Mabel to handle my communications. I was working 18-hour days. I never thought. That's the problem. Rebecca interrupted, her voice rising. You didn't think. You didn't check. You didn't care enough to wonder why the mother of your children never reached out. She did reach out, Joe added, his voice breaking. And you never knew because you buried yourself so deep in your perfect life that you couldn't see what you were losing. Richard felt like he was drowning. 15 years of decisions that had seemed justified, suddenly revealed as willful blindness. He'd trusted Mabel, told himself that if Allah really needed him, she'd find a way. Convinced himself that silence meant acceptance. But it hadn't been silence, it had been interception, erasure. His assistant deciding on his behalf that his children didn't deserve acknowledgement. And he'd been too blind to notice. You're right, Richard said quietly. My ignorance doesn't absolve me. I should have checked. I should have wondered. I should have looked for you. Instead of accepting the easiest story, Allah stood up abruptly, her entire body shaking. You don't get to do this. Do what? This, she gestured wildly. This moment of clarity where you suddenly understand everything, and we're all supposed to forgive you because you finally feel bad about what you did. Her voice rose to a shout. You don't get to rewrite the pain we lived through. You don't get to stand here and say, I'm sorry, and I was blind, and expect that to fix 15 years of abandonment. Tears poured down her face. I raised them alone, Richard. Alone. I worked 3 jobs. I went without food so they could eat. I lied to them about why their father never called because I couldn't bear to tell them the truth that you just didn't care enough. Joe and Rebecca were crying now too, silent tears streaming down their faces as their mother finally broke open. And now you want to what? Make up for lost time? Be a family? Allah's laugh was bitter and broken. You can't undo what you did. You can't give them back their childhood. You can't erase the years they spent feeling unwanted. Richard stood, his own eyes filling with tears. I know I can't fix this. Then what do you want? Allah demanded. A chance, Richard whispered. Just a chance to try. Alice stared at him, her chest heaving, her face wet with tears. And in that moment, standing in a luxury lounge overlooking a city he'd conquered while his family struggled below, Richard Bryson finally understood the true cost of everything he'd built. Truth has a way of finding us, doesn't it? No matter how far we run, no matter how much we bury, it catches up eventually. Some of you know what it's like when secrets finally surface, when the messages that should have been received never made it through. If this story is hitting close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes other people need to know they're not alone in carrying these burdens. Hit that share button. Pass this along. The lounge door opened suddenly, and Ellen stepped inside. Her face was composed now, makeup repaired, but her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. She'd changed something, straightened her posture, lifted her chin like a woman who'd decided to face humiliation with dignity rather than hide from it. "We need to go back out there," she said quietly. "All of us." Richard stood. "Ellen? You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her voice was steady now, resolved. "There are still reporters out there. Cameras, 300 guests who watched your engagement party implode and are now posting about it on every platform that exists. If we don't address this properly, the rumors will destroy what's left of both our reputations." Allah's eyes narrowed. "You want us to go back out there? In front of everyone?" "I want to end this with truth," Ellen replied. She looked at Richard, and something in her expression had shifted from devastation to steel. "You owe me that much, a real ending. Not a private conversation, in a hallway, that everyone will speculate about for months." Richard understood. She wanted closure, wanted to reclaim some control over a narrative that had been ripped away from her. "Okay," he said quietly. "If that's what you need." Ellen nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Richard looked at Alla and the twins. "You don't have to come. I can handle." "No." Joe stood up, still holding the banner. "We started this. We're seeing it through." Rebecca nodded, wiping her eyes. Alla's jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. They followed Ellen back into the ballroom. The scene that greeted them was chaos barely contained. At least 100 people remained: journalists, photographers, guests who'd been too fascinated by the scandal to leave. Phone cameras were raised. Professional photographers repositioned for better angles. The air buzzed with whispered speculation and the clicking of camera shutters. Ellen walked to the center platform where she and Richard had been standing hours ago when everything was perfect and planned. She turned to face the crowd, and the whispers faded as people realized something significant was about to happen. Richard stood beside her, acutely aware of Alla and the twins a few feet behind him. Ellen's voice carried across the ballroom, clear and trembling, but dignified. "I'm sure you all have questions about what happened tonight. I'm here to answer them." Cameras flashed like lightning. "Richard Bryson and I are no longer engaged." Ellen pulled the engagement ring from her purse. Richard realized she must have retrieved it from where he'd left it and held it up for everyone to see. "I'm returning this ring because I refuse to marry a man who doesn't love me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones captured every moment. Ellen turned to Richard, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice unwavering. "You're a good man, Richard, but you're not my man. You never were. Your heart has always belonged to someone else." She placed the ring in his hand, her fingers cold and shaking. "I wish you well," she whispered. "I hope you find whatever it is you've been looking for." Then she stepped back and addressed the crowd one final time. "The Bryson-Harris engagement is over. There will be no wedding, no merger, no questions. That's all I have to say." She walked off the platform with her head high, her winter rose gown trailing behind her like a flag of dignified surrender. The ballroom erupted. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Cameras swarmed. Brandon Harris appeared from somewhere in the crowd, his face purple with rage. "This is a disaster," he roared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Harris family wants nothing to do with this scandal. The merger is officially terminated. Bryson, you just destroyed both our companies." He stormed toward the exit, his assistants scrambling behind him. "We're done here. Harris Industries will be issuing a statement within the hour." More cameras, more shouting. The scandal was feeding on itself now, growing bigger with every second. And then the press turned their attention to the twins. "Is it true you're his children? How long have you known? Did your mother demand money? Why did you crash the party?" Microphones thrust toward Joe and Rebecca. Cameras crowded closer. Alla stepped in front of her children instinctively, trying to shield them. But there were too many reporters, too many flashes, too much chaos. Rebecca's face went pale. Joe's hands trembled. And Richard, watching his children being swarmed by strangers, demanding answers to questions they had no right to ask, felt something shift inside him. He moved. stepped directly in front of the twins, his body becoming a physical barrier between them and the press. His arms spread wide, blocking cameras, pushing microphones back. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Mr. Bryson, is it true? When did you find out? How much is child support?" "I said that's enough," Richard's voice thundered across the ballroom. The reporters fell silent, shocked. "These are children, my children, and you will not harass them." A camera flashed in his face. He knocked it aside. "You want a statement? Here's your statement. Yes, they're my children. Yes, I abandoned them 15 years ago. Yes, I'm a terrible father who chose his career over his family. Write that. Post that. Make it your headline." He turned, putting himself between the press and his family. "But you will not touch them. You will not photograph them without permission. You will not make them feel like they're on trial for existing." Allah stood frozen, watching him. Watching this man who'd walked away from everything, now standing firm against an entire room of people demanding answers. "We're leaving," Richard announced. "Through the side exit. If anyone follows us, I will have you arrested for harassment." He glanced at Allah. "Come on." She hesitated for only a moment, then grabbed Joe and Rebecca's hands and followed Richard through the crowd. Security guards, finally useful, created a path toward a service exit near the kitchen. The press tried to follow, shouting questions, but Richard's security team held them back. The heavy door closed behind them, muffling the chaos to a distant roar. They found themselves in a stark service corridor, all white walls and fluorescent lights. The contrast from the crystal ballroom was jarring, real, stripped of all pretense. Richard led them through the corridor to a private parking garage where his car waited, a black sedan that probably cost more than Allah's apartment. The driver opened the doors without a word. Richard gestured for them to get in. Allah looked at him like he was insane. "I'm not." "Please," Richard interrupted quietly. "Just let me get you away from this. Please." Joe and Rebecca climbed into the back seat without waiting for their mother's permission. After a moment, Allah followed, sliding in beside her children. Richard took the front passenger seat. The driver pulled out of the garage without asking for a destination, taking them away from the hotel, away from the cameras, away from the wreckage of Richard's carefully constructed life. Inside the car, silence pressed down like a weight. Joe stared out the window at the city lights sliding past. Rebecca's hands were still shaking. Allah held both her children close, her face pale and exhausted. Richard sat motionless in the front seat, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. His engagement was over. The merger had collapsed. His reputation was in ruins. Social media was probably exploding with videos and commentary and speculation. Everything he'd built over 15 years had just come crashing down in a single night. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror at Joe and Rebecca, his children, sitting in his car for the first time in their lives, Richard realized something profound. For the first time in 15 years, he'd made the right choice. The car drove on through the Manhattan night, carrying a broken billionaire and the family he'd finally stopped running from. Silent, stunned, forever changed. Sometimes the right choice looks like destruction from the outside. Sometimes choosing family means watching everything else fall apart. If you've ever had to make a choice between what looks good and what's actually right, leave a comment below. Your story matters. And who knows, maybe someone else reading this needs to hear that they're not the only one who's had to rebuild from the ground up. The car stopped in front of a small diner on the edge of Manhattan, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that came in thick white mugs. Richard's driver had brought them here without instruction, perhaps sensing that a billionaire's penthouse wasn't the right setting for this conversation. They filed inside silently. The late-night crowd was sparse, a few truck drivers, a woman studying textbooks, a teenager working the counter who barely glanced up. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the chandelier glow of the ballroom, but there was something honest about this place, something real. They took a corner booth, Allah and the twins on one side, Richard across from them. The banner lay folded on the seat beside Joe, paint-stained and wrinkled. A waitress appeared with a pot of coffee and 4 mugs. "You folks okay?" "We're fine," Allah said quietly. "Just coffee for now." The waitress poured and left. Steam rose from the mugs, filling the silence. Richard wrapped his hands around his cup, but didn't drink. He looked at Joe and Rebecca, really looked at them, and realized he knew nothing about these two people who carried his DNA and his eyes. "Tell me about your lives," he said. "School, friends, what you dream about. I want to know everything." Joe laughed bitterly. "Why? So you can feel better about missing it all?" "No," Richard said. "So I can understand what I did to you." The honesty landed like a stone in still water. Rebecca stirred sugar into her coffee with trembling hands. "I go to Washington High. I'm in 10th grade. I like art class because Miss Chen lets me stay after school and use the good paints." Her voice was small, careful, like she was testing whether these words mattered to anyone. "I paint mostly," she continued. "Landscapes, cityscapes, things that feel bigger than me." "You're talented," Richard said. "The banner, the way you mixed colors, the composition." "Don't," Rebecca's voice hardened. "Don't compliment the thing I made because I was desperate." Richard fell silent. Joe stared into his coffee. "I'm in 10th grade too, obviously. I play basketball. Not well. I'm on the bench mostly. But Coach Martinez lets me stay because he knows I need somewhere to go after school while Mom works." "Do you like basketball?" Richard asked. "I like not going home to an empty apartment," Joe replied flatly. "I like having teammates, even if they're not really my friends. His voice broke. "I like pretending I'm normal, like the other kids, the ones whose dads come to games." The pain in those words was unbearable. "I've been bullied," Joe continued, his hands clenched around his mug. "Since middle school. They call me fatherless. They say my mom probably doesn't even know who my dad is. They say I'm nobody, because I came from nobody." Alla's eyes filled with tears. "Joe, baby. And the worst part?" Joe's voice rose. "The absolute worst part is that I started believing them. Started thinking maybe they were right. Maybe the reason my father never came back is because I wasn't worth coming back for." Richard felt like he'd been stabbed. "That's not." "How would you know?" Joe shouted. "You weren't there. You don't know what it's like to have kids shove you in the hallway and call you a bastard. You don't know what it's like to eat lunch alone because nobody wants to sit with a kid who doesn't have a dad." Tears streamed down his face now. "You don't know what it's like to wonder every single day if there's something wrong with you, something that made you unlovable." Richard's throat closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Rebecca's voice was quieter, but no less devastating. "I'm terrified I'm going to turn out like you." Richard looked at her. "What?" "Cold," Rebecca whispered. "Distant. The kind of person who can walk away from people who love them and never look back. I see you in the mirror sometimes. I have your eyes. Your chin. And I wonder if I inherited your heart too. The kind that can just stop caring." "Rebecca, you're nothing like Allah started." "How do you know?" Rebecca's voice cracked. "What if I grow up and do the exact same thing to my own kids? What if I'm already broken the same way he is?" The fear in her voice was raw and real. The terror that abandonment was genetic, that coldness could be inherited like eye color or height. Alla's face crumpled. She turned to Richard, and her voice shook with years of buried pain. "You want to understand what you did? I'll tell you." She took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "There were nights I didn't eat, so they could. Nights I chose between electricity and groceries. I worked cleaning offices until 3 in the morning, then went to my receptionist job at 7. I didn't sleep. I couldn't afford to be sick. I couldn't afford to break down." Her voice rose, trembling with fury and grief. "I stitched their clothes by hand because new ones cost too much. I made birthday cakes from box mix and pretended they were fancy. I lied and told them we were fine when I was falling apart, and every single night I went to bed wondering if I was enough. If I could possibly be both mother and father to 2 children who deserved so much better." Tears poured down her face. "You weren't there when Rebecca had pneumonia and I couldn't afford the medication. You weren't there when Joe came home with a black eye and I had to explain why some kids have dads who teach them to fight back and he didn't. You weren't there for first days of school, lost teeth, nightmares, report cards, scraped knees, broken hearts." Her voice broke completely. "You weren't there. And I had to be everything. And some days I was so tired I wanted to disappear. But I couldn't. Because they needed me. Because someone had to stay." The diner fell silent except for Allah's quiet sobs. Richard felt tears streaming down his own face. Every word was a truth he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Every sentence was a bill come due. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't give us back 15 years, Joe said bitterly. "I know." Richard's voice was steady, despite the tears. "I can't give you back what I took. I can't undo the bullying or the hardship, or the nights you went to bed wondering why you weren't enough. I can't fix this." He looked at all three of them. Alla exhausted and heartbroken, Joe angry and wounded, Rebecca terrified and vulnerable. "But I can promise you this, I won't run anymore. I won't pretend you don't exist. I won't choose my comfort over your truth. If you'll let me, I want to earn a place in your lives. Not claim one, earn it." Rebecca stared at him, her storm gray eyes searching his face. "If you want to start," she said slowly, "then stop pretending we're strangers." Joe reached for the banner beside him, unfolded it slowly. The paint was smeared now, wrinkled from being gripped too tightly. But the words were still visible. "We're not bastards." He held it up, quieter now, smaller, like a question instead of an accusation. "Call us your children," Joe whispered. Richard stood, walked around to their side of the booth. He took the banner gently from Joe's hands and folded it carefully, like it was something precious, something that mattered. Then he knelt beside the booth so he was eye level with the twins. "You are my son," he said to Joe, his voice breaking. He turned to Rebecca. "You are my daughter." He looked up at Alla. "And you are the strongest person I've ever known. You raised two incredible human beings. You did everything I should have done, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of a place beside you." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rebecca leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Richard's neck. Her body shook with sobs against his shoulder. Joe hesitated, then followed. His arms came around both of them, trembling and uncertain. Alla's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming through her fingers. Richard held his children, truly held them for the first time in 15 years. The embrace was awkward and incomplete, and raw. Rebecca was crying. Joe was rigid with emotion. Richard's own shoulders shook. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. It wasn't even close to okay. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, when you've been broken for 15 years, a beginning is everything. The morning after the engagement party collapsed, Richard's phone had 372 missed calls, 194 text messages, and 47 voicemails from investors, board members, and journalists demanding explanations. He deleted every single one. Then he called his executive assistant. "Cancel everything. Press conferences, business trips, the investor meeting in London. All of it. Sir, the London meeting is critical. Cancel it," Richard repeated, "and get me Mabel's personal number, now." 20 minutes later, he was sitting across from Mabel Chen in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Bryson Innovations headquarters. She looked older than he remembered, graying hair, tired eyes, hands that trembled as she stirred her latte. "You intercepted Alla's messages," Richard said without preamble. Mabel's face went pale. "Richard, don't deny it. She already told me. I need to hear it from you." The silence stretched between them like broken glass. Finally, Mabel nodded. "I did. Emails, phone calls, letters. All of them? Why? Because you were 27 years old, with investors breathing down your neck, and a company that was one bad quarter away from bankruptcy." Mabel's voice shook. "A baby scandal would have destroyed everything. So I protected you. You made that choice for me," Richard said quietly. "You decided my children didn't deserve to know their father. I thought I was helping. You weren't." Richard stood, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "This is your resignation letter. I've already drafted it. Sign it." Mabel's eyes filled with tears. "Richard, please. I've worked for you for 15 years. And for 15 years, you kept my children from me." His voice was steel. "Sign it, or I'll make sure every company in this city knows what you did." Mabel signed with shaking hands. Richard walked out without looking back. That afternoon, he showed up at Washington High School. The guidance counselor looked startled when Richard Bryson, still trending on social media, still front-page news, walked into her office asking about Joe and Rebecca Richmond's academic records. "I'm their father," Richard said simply. "I'd like to understand how they're doing, what they need, how I can help." The counselor pulled their files. Joe's grades were average, dipping in subjects he'd clearly given up on. Rebecca's were better, especially in art, but there were notes about missed assignments, absences when Alla couldn't afford to miss work, and the twins stayed home sick alone. They're good kids, the counselor said carefully, but they've been struggling socially. There have been bullying incidents. Richard's jaw tightened. What kind of incidents? She described the hallway taunts, the lunchroom isolation, the whispers that followed them like shadows. I want to be informed, Richard said. Every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every time someone makes them feel like they don't matter, I want to know. The counselor studied him with something that might have been hope. Mr. Bryson, showing up matters more than money ever will. Then I'll show up, Richard promised. And he did. He attended Joe's next basketball practice, sitting in the bleachers with the other parents. Joe saw him, stumbled during a drill, then pretended he hadn't noticed. But Richard saw the way his shoulders straightened slightly, the way he played just a little harder. After practice, Joe walked past Richard without speaking. But he didn't tell him to leave either. That was good, Richard said to Joe's back. Your free throw form, it's solid. Joe stopped, turned halfway. You don't know anything about basketball. No, Richard admitted, but I know what it looks like when someone's working hard. And you were. Joe's jaw worked like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or something else. Finally, he shrugged. Coach says I need to stop hesitating on the shot. Then stop hesitating, Richard said. You're better than you think you are. Joe almost smiled. Almost. You sound like Mom. Your mom's usually right. This time Joe did smile, just barely, before walking to the locker room. It wasn't much, but it was something. Rebecca was harder. Richard showed up at her art class one afternoon with permission from Miss Chen. Rebecca was painting a cityscape, buildings at sunset, all sharp angles and bleeding oranges and purples that somehow captured loneliness. You're really talented, Richard said quietly. Rebecca didn't look up. You already said that. I meant it. She kept painting, her brushstrokes deliberate and controlled. Lots of people are talented. It doesn't mean anything. It means you see things other people don't, Richard replied. That's rare. Rebecca finally looked at him. Her storm gray eyes, so much like his own, were guarded, careful. Because I want to know you. You had 15 years to know me. I know. Richard didn't flinch from the truth. And I can't get those years back. But I can try not to waste whatever time you're willing to give me. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her painting. Miss Chen says I might be good enough to apply to art programs. After high school. Do you want to? I want to do something that matters, Rebecca said quietly. I want to make things that make people feel less alone. Richard felt his throat tighten. Then I'll help you. Whatever you need. Applications, portfolio, anything. Why? Rebecca's voice cracked. Why now? Because I finally stopped running, Richard said simply. Rebecca's hands stilled on her brush. She didn't respond. But she didn't send him away either. Alla was the hardest. She'd let Richard into the twins' lives slowly, carefully, like someone testing ice to see if it would hold. But when he tried to talk to her about anything beyond logistics, she shut down. We need to discuss visitation schedules, was all business. The twins need winter coats, was practical. But when Richard asked, can we talk, really talk? Alla's face would close like a door slamming shut. Until one evening when Richard showed up at her apartment building carrying groceries. Not expensive imports or luxury brands, just regular groceries from the store 3 blocks away. Alla opened the door, saw the bags, and sighed. Richard, I'm not trying to buy you, he said quickly. I wanted to contribute. The way I should have been contributing all along. Alla stared at him. Then, surprisingly, she stepped aside. They're doing homework. You can help Joe with algebra. He hates it. Richard helped Joe with algebra, made Rebecca laugh with a terrible joke about parabolas. Set the table without being asked. And when dinner was ready, just spaghetti and jarred sauce, nothing fancy, they sat together in Alla's tiny kitchen with its chipped linoleum and flickering overhead light. It was awkward. Joe made sarcastic comments that covered vulnerability. Rebecca watched Richard like he might disappear. Alla barely ate, her hands gripping her fork too tightly. But they were together. After the twins went to their room to finish homework, Richard helped Alla wash dishes in the sink that was too small and had a dripping faucet. "I'm scared," Alla said suddenly. Richard looked at her. "Of what?" "Of this," she gestured vaguely. "Of letting you back in. Of the twins starting to care, and then you leaving again when it gets hard." "I won't." "You don't know that," Alla interrupted. "You can't promise that. People leave, Richard. You already proved that." Richard set down the dish he was washing. "You're right. I can't promise I'll be perfect. I can't promise I won't make mistakes. But I can promise I won't run. Not from them. Not from you." Alla's eyes filled with tears. "I loved you so much. And when you left, it nearly destroyed me." "I know. Do you?" Her voice broke. "Do you understand what it's like to love someone so completely that you rearrange your entire life around them, and then watch them walk away like you were nothing?" "No," Richard admitted, "I don't. But I understand what it's like to spend 15 years trying to fill the space where love used to be and realizing nothing fits." Alla wiped her eyes roughly. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Richard said. "I'm asking for a chance, not just with the twins, with you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the boy she loved in this man who'd become a stranger. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Me too," Richard replied. They finished the dishes in silence. And when Richard left that night, walking down the narrow stairwell of Alla's building, he looked back to see her standing in the doorway. Still watching, still scared, still hoping. It wasn't love, not yet, not again. But it was something fragile and promising. And for the first time in 15 years, that felt like enough. Rebuilding takes time, doesn't it? You don't fix 15 years of damage overnight. But every small moment, every dinner, every homework session, every "I'll show up," that's how trust gets built back, brick by brick. If you're rooting for this family, hit that like button. Let us know you're here. Let us know these stories matter to you. Because we're all in this together. 3 weeks after the engagement party collapsed, Richard stood in front of a wall of cameras at a press conference he'd insisted on holding himself. No PR team, no carefully scripted statements. Just him, a microphone, and the truth he should have told 15 years ago. The room was packed. Every major outlet had sent reporters. Social media had turned the Bryson scandal into the most talked about story of the year, dissected, analyzed, memed into oblivion. Some commentators called him a deadbeat billionaire. Others called him a cautionary tale. A few called him something worse. Richard didn't care what they called him anymore. He adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the cameras. 3 weeks ago, my engagement party was interrupted by 2 teenagers holding a banner that said, "We're not bastards." Those teenagers are Joe and Rebecca Richmond. And they're my children. The room erupted with camera flashes and shouted questions. Richard held up his hand. "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to tell you what I should have said 15 years ago. I was wrong. I walked away from the woman I loved and the family we created because I was terrified that being a father would destroy my career. I chose ambition over love, success over responsibility, and for 15 years, I convinced myself that was the right choice." His voice steadied, grew stronger. "But there is no version of success that's built on abandoning your children. There is no empire worth more than being present for the people who need you. Joe and Rebecca grew up without a father because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. Their mother, Alla Richmond, raised them alone, worked multiple jobs, sacrificed everything while I built buildings and bought penthouses and pretended I didn't have a family depending on me." Richard's throat tightened, but he pushed through. "People have asked me what I plan to do now. Here's my answer. I plan to spend the rest of my life trying to be the father I should have been from the beginning. I plan to show up, to listen, to prove that it's never too late to choose love over fear." He looked directly into the camera. "Joe and Rebecca, if you're watching this, you are not bastards. You are not mistakes. You are not nobodies. You are my son and my daughter, and you are the best part of my life. Everything else I've built, every dollar, every deal, every achievement, means nothing compared to the chance to know you." The room fell silent. "That's all I have to say. Thank you." Richard walked off the platform, ignoring the explosion of questions behind him. In her tiny apartment across town, Alla sat on the couch between Joe and Rebecca, watching the press conference on her laptop. Tears streamed down her face as Richard spoke, not the carefully constructed billionaire addressing his board, but a broken man, finally telling the truth. "He means it," Rebecca whispered. "Mom, he actually means it." Alla nodded, unable to speak, because she'd seen something in Richard's eyes during that press conference, something she hadn't seen in 15 years. Sincerity. The scandal didn't disappear overnight, but something shifted in the public narrative. The gossip sites that had mocked Richard now ran stories about redemption. Parents shared his press conference with captions about second chances. Commentators debated whether it was possible to come back from 15 years of absence. But in Alla's kitchen, none of that mattered. What mattered was Richard showing up every Tuesday for family dinner. What mattered was Joe's basketball games, where Richard sat in the bleachers and cheered louder than anyone else. What mattered was Rebecca's art show, where Richard bought every single one of her paintings and hung them in his office. What mattered was the slow, painful, beautiful work of becoming a family. One evening, after Joe and Rebecca had gone to bed, Richard stayed to help Alla clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, now no longer strangers, not quite healed, but something in between. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said, drying the last plate. "You just did," Alla replied, but she smiled slightly. "Alla." Richard turned to face her, his expression serious. "Let me stay. Not for my image. Not because it looks good, or because the press expects it. Let me stay for us. For you." Alla's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Richard, I know I don't deserve a second chance," he continued. "I know I hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But I'm asking anyway. Because the truth is, I never stopped loving you. I buried it. Ignored it. Convinced myself it was gone. But it wasn't. It never was." Alla pulled her hands from the water, dried them slowly. "I never stopped loving you either." Richard's breath caught. "But love isn't trust," Alla continued, her voice shaking. "I loved you 15 years ago, and you still left. Loving you doesn't mean I'm not terrified you'll do it again. I won't." "You can't promise that," Alla interrupted gently. "No one can promise forever. But what I need to know is whether you're willing to prove it. Day by day. Through the hard parts and the boring parts and the parts where being a father isn't romantic or dramatic, it's just showing up." Richard stepped closer. "That's exactly what I'm asking for. The chance to prove it, day by day, for as long as you'll let me." Alla looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy she'd fallen in love with in that hotel kitchen, mixed with the man who'd finally stopped running. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay? Okay. But this is slow. This is careful. This is—" Richard kissed her, soft and trembling and full of 15 years of regret and hope. When they pulled apart, Alla was crying. "Don't break our hearts again." "I won't," Richard promised. "I swear to you, I won't." 2 weeks later, Richard invited Joe, Rebecca, and Alla to his penthouse for the first time. The twins stood outside the building, staring up at the glass tower that seemed to touch the clouds. Joe's hands were shoved in his pockets. Rebecca held Alla's hand tightly. "This is where he lives?" Joe asked. "This is where he lives," Alla confirmed. They rode the private elevator to the top floor in silence. When the doors opened directly into Richard's penthouse, both twins stopped and stared. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, modern furniture that probably cost more than their entire apartment building, art on the walls that looked like it belonged in museums. "Holy," Joe started. "Language," Alla warned automatically. Richard appeared from the kitchen, looking nervous in a way billionaires probably shouldn't. "You came. You invited us," Rebecca said simply. Richard nodded. "I want you to see this place. Not because I'm trying to impress you, but because someday, if you want, this could be your home too. Part-time, whenever you want. Your rooms are already set up." Joe's eyes went wide. "Our rooms? Come see." Richard led them down a hallway. He opened the first door to reveal a bedroom decorated in blues and grays, with a basketball hoop mounted on the wall and a desk positioned near the window. "For you," Richard said to Joe. "If you want it." Joe walked inside slowly, touching the basketball hoop like it might disappear. The second room was filled with natural light. easels positioned to catch the sun, shelves stocked with art supplies that made Rebecca's eyes go wide. "For you," Richard said to Rebecca. She walked to the easel, ran her fingers over pristine brushes, then turned to Richard with tears in her eyes. "You did this for me?" "I did this for both of you," Richard said, "because you're my children, and I want you to have a place here, always." Alla stood in the hallway watching her children explore rooms that had been designed just for them, and something in her chest finally began to heal. Later, they sat together on Richard's massive couch, Chinese takeout spread across the coffee table, because despite the penthouse kitchen, nobody knew what to cook. Joe made jokes about the view. Rebecca sketched the skyline on a napkin. Richard told terrible dad jokes that made everyone groan, and Alla watched them, this fragile, broken, healing family, and felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Hope. As they were getting ready to leave, Alla touched Richard's arm. He turned, and she whispered so only he could hear, "This isn't forgiveness yet, but it's a beginning." Richard's eyes filled with tears. Beginnings are everything. Joe and Rebecca walked to the elevator holding Alla's hands, but they looked back at Richard with something that might have been trust. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in 15 years, the Bryson Richmond family stepped into a future that finally belonged to all of them. Not perfect, not painless, not without scars, but together. And together, they were learning, was everything that mattered. Beginnings are everything, aren't they? After 15 years of broken pieces, this family found their way back to each other. Not because it was easy, not because forgiveness came quickly, but because someone finally stopped running and started showing up. If this story touched you, if you see yourself in Alla's strength, or Joe and Rebecca's courage, or even Richard's long journey back to what matters, then you're part of this community. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Comment and tell us what you thought. Share this with someone who needs to know that broken families can heal. And most of all, thank you for being here, for watching, for caring. These stories matter because you make them matter. Until next time.